Chapter 13 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Carthago est delenda. The two antagonistic ideas of the Union after 70 years of expansion and conflict had crashed together in the storm of civil war. Northern interests were not separable from the Union. To it, undoubtedly, the free states owed their unprecedented increase in population, their surprising development of material resources, and their rapid augmentation of wealth. Naturally enough, therefore, they held in abhorrence a Southern Confederacy, for destruction of the Union carried, as a consequence, ruin to all this growth and prosperity. The war on the part of the free states was for the maintenance of the Union, and for no other purpose. Lincoln's indifference as to the fate of slavery in this emergency of the Republic was hardly less complete or shocking than was that of Douglas, who cared not whether slavery was voted up or voted down in the national territories, since popular sovereignty was vindicated. Lincoln, as president, was not concerned as to whether slavery survived or perished, if only the Union survived. As a man, he was probably not indifferent on this point, but as president he avowedly meant slavery within the states and entrenched within the Constitution and the laws of the land, no harm from the war power of the government over which he presided. He was openly, notoriously, for maintaining the Constitution as it was, the Union as it was, even to the execution of its infamous fugitive slave laws. It took 2 years to reveal to the President and the Republican party the folly of such a purpose, the madness of a statesmanship which was pouring out blood and treasure to preserve the federation of two contrary social systems under a single general government, when the opportunity offered of putting an end to one and of establishing forever the other. At length it was perceived beyond a peradventure that the institution which the administration was preserving was the pith, the marrow, and backbone of the rebellion. It too was seen that the fortunes of the slave and the fortunes of the Union were not detachable and distinct the one from the other, but identical and indissoluble. Then it was that the slave was emancipated and made a soldier to save a Union essential to the supremacy of Northern ideas and to the security of Northern interests and institutions in America. Sumner, during the antebellum period of crisis and suspense, recognized with all his old-time clarity of vision the constitutional limitations of the political movement against slavery. He did not propose to touch the evil within the states because he had not the power. To the utmost verge of the Constitution he pushed his opposition. Here he drew up ready to cross this Rubicon of the slave power should justificatory cause arise. Such he considered was the uprising of the South in rebellion. Treason canceled the covenants of the Constitution and discharged the North from their further observance. He was at last, untrammeled by political conditions, free to carry the war into Africa. Carthago est delenda was thenceforth constantly on his lips. It is the vogue now to extol the marvelous sagacity of Abraham Lincoln, and the writer, too, will join in the panegyric of his great qualities. But in the matter of emancipation that wise man was not infallible, the opinion of his latest biographers to the contrary notwithstanding. He waited for the people, but the people were really ready for the act as a war measure before he was. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the South but a little later began to weigh the military necessity of a similar movement. Sagacious, undoubtedly, the President was, wonderfully so, but slow at times also to a surprising degree, and this was true with regard to his conduct in relation to the liberation of the slaves. To have saved the Union with slavery was surely not such a preservation of his as mere worldly prudence ought to have dictated. All that it could possibly have accomplished was a short postponement of the final struggle for mastery between what was morally and industrially wrong and what was morally and industrially right in the Republic. A day of wrath this struggle would have been in 1900, as it was in 1861. To put off this day, then, would have consummated the most stupendous crime of fathers against children of modern times. Yet such was distinctly Mr. Lincoln's purpose as President. It certainly was not Mr. Sumner's as Senator. Justice was his solitary expedient, right his unfailing sagacity. Of no other American statesman can this be so unqualifiedly asserted. Here he is the transcendent figure in our political history, and yet he was no fanatical visionary, utopian dreamer, but a practical moralist in the domain of politics. When President and party refused to heed him and turned from his simple and straightforward remedy to try others, he did not break with them nor sulk at his post. On the contrary, foot to foot and shoulder to shoulder, he pulled with both as far as they would go. Where they halted he could not. Stuck as the wheels of state and of the war were in those dreadful years in the mire of political expediency and pro-slavery hunkerism, he appealed confidently to that large unknown quantity of courage and righteousness latent in the North to set the balked wheels again moving. The policy of forbearance towards slavery, which characterized to so remarkable an extent the early part of Mr. Lincoln's administration, was at first interpreted liberally by Mr. Sumner. The President seemed to be making haste slowly to attack the enemy at a vital point, which course during the first months of the war Sumner cordially approved. And this approval he communicated to Mr. Lincoln in the month of May preceding the Battle of Bull Run, adding, however, that the President must be ready to strike when the moment came. Upon the happening of that event, Sumner felt that the time had arrived for the adoption of a presidential policy of active hostility toward the peculiar institution, and this conviction he imparted to the President 2 days after the Bull Run disaster. But Mr. Lincoln received the suggestion with undisguised impatience. No, the moment had not come to strike slavery. Instead of striking slavery, the administration struck several thumping blows upon the backs of the slaves in its jealous regard for the rights of masters. Fugitive slaves, so ran a general order from Washington July 17th. Fugitive slaves will under no pretext whatever be permitted to reside or in any way be harbored in the quarters and camps of the troops serving in this department. Neither will such slaves be allowed to accompany troops on the march. Commanders of troops will be held responsible for a strict observance of this order. 6 days afterward, the administration, through Attorney General Bates, reminded the United States Marshals of Missouri that the Fugitive Slave Act must be executed, and to General Butler's famous suggestion that the able-bodied Negroes liable to be used in aid of rebellion were contraband of war, the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, replied in August that it is the desire of the President that all existing rights in all the states be fully respected and maintained. August 30th, General Fremont, commanding the Western Department, had made proclamation that the property, real and personal, of all persons in the State of Missouri who shall take up arms against the United States or who shall be directly proven to have taken an active part with their enemies in the field is declared to be confiscated to the public use, and their slaves, if any they have, are hereby declared freemen. Notwithstanding the outburst of popular satisfaction with which this last clause of the order was received, President Lincoln promptly countermanded it. He was plainly bent on saving the Union, if he could, without in any manner disturbing the status quo of invested interest in the slave states. This amazing conservatism was unspeakably painful to Sumner and excited his keenest apprehensions in respect of its demoralizing consequences in the conduct of the war. It was injurious to the cause of the Union at home and abroad. It operated in the South to strengthen, not weaken, the spirit of rebellion. Sumner, unable to influence the President, turned to the people. Perhaps they could show the administration the error of its way, induce it to change its policy of forbearance to bold and active anti-slavery measures. As early as July, he endeavored to get Congress to inaugurate a new and militant policy in the treatment of rebels. 2 bills introduced by him into the Senate prior to the Battle of Bull Run provided for the confiscation of the property of traitors. This was one way, certainly, of starting off on a new departure in the conduct of the war. At the Republican State Convention of Massachusetts, which met at Worcester, October 1, 1861, he demonstrated in an electric speech that emancipation was the best weapon for putting down the rebellion and saving the Union. It is not necessary, even borrowing a familiar phrase, he declared with singular sagacity, to carry the war into Africa. It will be enough if we carry Africa into the war in any form, any quantity, any way. The moment this is done, rebellion will begin its bad luck, and the Union becomes secure forever. Facts, a year later, completely verified this bold prediction. On the evening of November 27th, before the Young Men's Republican Union of New York, at Cooper Institute, he pointed out, in an argument of masterly force, that slavery was the origin and mainspring of the rebellion. Wherever this rebellion shows itself, whatever form it takes, whatever thing it does, whatever it meditates, exclaimed the orator, it is moved by slavery. Nay, the rebellion is slavery itself incarnate, living, acting, raging, robbing, murdering, according to the essential law of its being. And again the slaves toil at home, while the masters work at rebellion, and thus by singular fatality is this doomed race, without taking up arms, actually engaged in feeding, supporting, succoring, invigorating those battling for their enslavement. Full well I know that this is an element of strength only through the forbearance of our own government. And coming to the point of the argument, he finds that something more is needed to encounter successfully the rebellion than men and money. That decisive something which the war for the Union wanted was ideas. Our battalions must be reinforced by ideas, he sums up, and we must strike directly at the origin and mainspring. I do not say now in what way or to what extent, but only that we must strike. In no way can we do so much at so little cost. To the enemy such a blow will be a terror. To good men it will be an encouragement, and to foreign nations watching this contest it will be an earnest of something beyond a mere carnival of battle. There has been the cry, "On to Richmond," and still another worse cry, "On to England." Better than either is the cry, "On to freedom." Let this be heard in the voices of our soldiers, aye, let it resound in the purposes of the government, and victory must be near. No opportunity did Sumner now miss to press upon President, Congress, and the country the duty and necessity of emancipation. From this time forward he never saw Mr. Lincoln without urging him to strike the great criminal, without warning him that then was the accepted time for dispatching the monster. But Mr. Lincoln did not so apprehend the situation, nor the urgency of immediate action. He would wait yet a while longer. He was, according to his own calculation, but 6 weeks behind Sumner. The weeks, however, stretched into months, and still the presidential arm was stayed. In the meantime, Congress was not inactive. It took the initiative in the military movement against slavery as the origin and mainspring of the rebellion. In the measure to confiscate property used for insurrectionary purposes, slaves so employed were declared free by the act, which, on its approval by the President August 6, 1861, was the beginning of emancipation. This act was followed in March, 1862, by another, which prohibited the employment of the national forces in the return of fugitive slaves. It was thus largely through the earnestness and determination of Sumner that a path was hewed for the feet of Mr. Lincoln to emancipation as a measure of military necessity. When the slave masters retired from the Senate and the Republican party obtained control of that body, Mr. Sumner was placed at the head of the Committee on Foreign Relations. In this position he was enabled to render inestimable services to the country and to the cause of freedom as well. His extensive acquaintance in Europe and his immense acquisitions as a student of history and of international law made him a power at home and abroad during the progress of the war as chairman of that committee. His speech on the Trent episode was one of the greatest services rendered by him to the administration and the country in that capacity. Two of Sumner's old enemies, James M. Mason, the former chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations, and John Slidell of Louisiana, were appointed to represent the rebel states, the former at the court of St. James and the latter at the court of Napoleon III. In October 1861, with their two secretaries, they eluded the blockade at Charleston and were landed at Havana. From this place they took passage in the British mail packet Trent for St. Thomas, where a line of steamers connecting with the Trent ran to England. When near St. Thomas, the Trent was stopped by the United States steamer San Jacinto, commanded by Captain Wilkes, and the rebel commissioners and their two secretaries were taken into custody and removed to the national steamer. This proceeding of Captain Wilkes, though in strict accord with British precedent, was in violation of the principle in that regard uniformly contended for by America. But this latter fact was at first quite lost sight of by the statesmen and diplomatic scholars and lawyers of the land. The capture gave general satisfaction in the United States, made Captain Wilkes the hero of the hour. In England, however, the act excited very different emotions. It brought the hostility of that country toward the United States to a head. The English government demanded the surrender of the traitors, and in case of the refusal of the American government to comply therewith, instructed its minister at Washington, Lord Lyons, to return to London with the entire legation. Pending the consideration of this demand by the administration, Great Britain, like the wild boar in the fable, began industriously to whet its tusks for a war which in its consequences must have proven disastrous to the cause of the Union and of freedom alike. Plainly, under the circumstances, there was but one course for the American government to pursue, and that was to throw itself back upon American practice rather than upon British precedent, and surrender the prisoners. And this it did, though not without embarrassment, in view of the popularity of the capture of those men and of the deep resentment felt by all classes against the demand for their release. If the popular feeling was warlike in England, it was equally so in America. The government, in getting rid of a war with England, could ill afford to do so by forfeiting the respect and confidence of its own citizens, whose love of country was without doubt sorely wounded by what to the public eye seemed like an ignominious back-down before British insolence and menace. It fell to the lot of Sumner to rescue the administration from this predicament by appeasing the irritated national amour propre, which he achieved in a masterly speech before the Senate, January 9, 1862, entitled "The Trent Case and Maritime Rights." He demonstrated to the almost universal satisfaction of the country, if not of the world, that the surrender of the rebel commissioners was not a back-down, but that, on the contrary, it was in strict accord with American principle and practice touching the right of search of neutral vessels at sea by belligerent powers. It was the American contention that these powers could not, in the exercise of the right of search, board neutral vessels at sea and take out of them persons on whom such nations might otherwise have perfectly valid claims. This grand principle was now established by the demand of England and the act of America. America, therefore, had no cause for feeling humiliated by the surrender of the prisoners, but rather the strongest reason for experiencing a sense of accomplishment and triumph. To her other glories she had added the glory of leading the way to the reformation of long existing abuses and wrongs in the law of nations. If America had surrendered the rebels to England, England had surely surrendered a bad principle and the support of many bad precedents to America. The speech produced a profound impression at home and abroad. The London Times was greatly chagrined at the skilful manner in which the orator had turned the surrender to the advantage of the American government and of the American people. The great object of this remarkable oration, growled a famous correspondent of the Thunderer, is to prove that the surrender of Messrs. Slidell and Mason is a great triumph for the American government. There is proverbially no accounting for taste, and if the American people are of Mr. Sumner's opinion, I do not see why we should complain of their contentment. But neither the Times nor its famous correspondent was able to laugh down, or sneer down, or argue down the force of the speech. Sumner, with his customary thoroughness, had done what he set out to do, vindicated the government, established for it in the popular regard a fresh claim to the confidence and support of the loyal North. And this was in effect dealing another blow upon the head of slavery, the supreme traitor, the origin and mainspring of the rebellion. Sumner's labors for the recognition of the independence of the black republics, Haiti and Liberia, by the United States had similar results. He found the spirit of slavery entrenched in public opinion and the laws of the land, and it was his purpose to strike it there as well as at the South in its chattel form. If dislodged from those coigns of vantage in the Republic, if disowned by public opinion and expelled from the national statutes, he believed that it could be the more readily and effectively dealt with in the rebellious states. A move for the recognition of the black republics was a move against the many-headed wrong of slavery. Before the war, the slave power refused all recognition of Haiti and Liberia as members of the family of nations. Nearly a year after the opening of hostilities, President Lincoln, with characteristic caution, suggested the subject to Congress in his annual message, remarking that if any good reason exists why we should persevere longer in withholding our recognition of the independence and sovereignty of Haiti and Liberia, I am unable to discern it. He goes on to say that he is unwilling to inaugurate a novel policy in regard to them without the approbation of Congress, and thereupon submits to its consideration the expediency of an appropriation for maintaining a charge d'affaires in each of those new states. This was enough for Sumner, who immediately took the matter up and pursued it with such zeal, discretion, and perseverance that in June these states received their long-deferred recognition at the hands of the United States. Governor Andrew felt that the recognition of Haiti and Liberia was in effect a recognition of the colored man of the Union as well, and that the passage of the law placed a fresh jewel in Sumner's crown. The considerable and essential service of Sumner toward the success of the measure found grateful acknowledgment and appreciation from the two countries. The Liberian commissioners, Alexander Crummell, Edward W. Blyden, and J.D. Johnson, who were at the time in Washington, promptly expressed the sentiments of Liberia to Mr. Sumner. Had it not been for your masterly policy, they wrote him, and your wise discretion, allied to a most persistent determination, we have reason to doubt whether the bill of recognition would not have met with a miscarriage during the present session of Congress. The objection to the passage of the Bill of Recognition by Mr. Salisbury of Delaware is so absolutely absurd, so incredibly comic and utterly asinine, that the writer begs to reproduce it as a curiosity of the ratiocination of a slave master's mind in a senatorial debate. It is evident, observed the acute Mr. Salisbury, that this bill is going to pass. I want the country, however, to know that according to the rules of the Senate, foreign ministers have a right upon this floor, and we have set apart a portion of the gallery for the ministers and their families. If this bill should pass both houses of Congress and become a law, I predict that in 12 months some Negro will walk upon the floor of the Senate of the United States and carry his family into that gallery which is set apart for foreign ministers. If that is agreeable to the taste and feeling of the people of this country, it is not of mine. To mine, and I only say that I will not be responsible for any such act. With this I will content myself. The final suppression of the slave trade by treaty between Great Britain and the United States was another effective blow dealt the hydra of the land, the ratification of which by the Senate received the powerful aid of the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations. The ratification of a treaty between the two countries giving to each on the coasts of Africa and America a restricted right of search in suspected vessels flying the national colors of the other was, so long as the slave power dominated the Senate, a thing impossible of accomplishment. The right was yielded for the African coast, but persistently withheld for the American, where it was notorious that slavers prowled with their African victims for the Southern market. But as the war waxed, a new spirit arose in the North against this inhuman commerce. A federal law had denounced it as piracy and punishable with death. But while the slave power ruled, the law remained on the statute book a dead letter. The rising hatred of slavery as the origin and mainspring of the rebellion, which was spreading through the North, galvanized on February 21, 1862, into sudden and terrible life the dead letter of that law in the execution under it at New York of Nathaniel Gordon, an African slave trader. The treaty for the final suppression of the atrocious traffic passed the Senate April 24, 1862. 8 days before the ratification of the treaty for the suppression of the African slave trade, slavery was abolished by law in the District of Columbia. Sumner sustained a principal part in the consummation of this great act. He was pained and discouraged by the absence from the annual message of the President of any proposition or discussion touching emancipation. There was nothing in that document to indicate that Mr. Lincoln was considering the subject at all. On the contrary, the President had told him of circumstances which might lead him to infer that Mr. Lincoln was still opposed to the use of this best weapon in the prosecution of the war for the Union. From the report of Simon Cameron, then Secretary of War, the President had struck a strong passage in relation to this very matter. But notwithstanding these unfavorable symptoms, Sumner began to feel assured that the President was seriously grappling with the question. It was not long before Sumner's faith in the President was happily confirmed. Early on the morning of March 6th, he was summoned to meet Mr. Lincoln, who read to him the draft of the special message of that date, proposing compensated emancipation. Sumner, who was never inclined to attach much value to the schemes for compensated emancipation, especially on a large scale, was too thankful for this evidence that the President was ready to move abolitionward, to take a new departure, however slight, from the old policy of forbearance, for other than cordial words of welcome for the message. At his instance, the President struck a doubtful paragraph from the draft. That day the message was communicated to the Senate that the good work, as far as Mr. Lincoln was concerned, was begun, although no practical results followed this particular act of his. The principle of compensated emancipation on a small scale had been embodied in a bill introduced in the Senate by Henry Wilson, December 16, for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Sumner, unwilling to endorse the principle of compensated emancipation because it involved recognition of right of property in persons, treated the measure as a scheme for the ransom of the slaves at the national capital, rejecting with indignation the wild and guilty fantasy that man can hold property in man. He nevertheless was ready to help to build a bridge of gold for the banishment of the barbarism of slavery. Amidst all present solicitudes were the fervid and cheering words with which he closed his able and elaborate argument in support of the bill for emancipation. Amidst all present solicitudes, the future cannot be doubtful. At the national capital, slavery will give way to freedom, but the good work will not stop here. It must proceed. What God and nature decree, rebellion cannot arrest. And as the whole widespread tyranny begins to tumble, then, above the din of battle, sounding from the sea and echoing along the land, above even the exaltations of victory on hard-fought fields, will ascend voices of gladness wherever civilization bears sway, to commemorate a sacred triumph whose trophies, instead of tattered banners, are ransomed slaves. On April 16, 1862, the District Emancipation Act received the approval of the President. It was freedom's first practical victory over slavery in the government. Mr. Lincoln, true to his character for going slow where any disturbance of the status quo of the invested interests of slave masters was involved, withheld his approval from the measure 5 days after it passed the House. This delay of the President gave rise to no little anxiety on the part of the supporters of the bill. Among these anxious friends was Mr. Sumner, who during this painful period called on Mr. Lincoln and expressed the astonishment which he felt that the author of the special message on compensated emancipation could postpone his approval of the District Emancipation Act a single night. Do you know who at this moment is the largest slaveholder in this country? Sumner asked the great man with caustic irony, and without waiting for reply, answered thus: "It is Abraham Lincoln, for he holds all the 3,000 slaves of the district, which is more than any other person in the country holds." But if Mr. Lincoln was loath to meddle with the status quo of slavery in the Union, not so was Mr. Sumner, who was ever in motion and running a tilt, now at one, now at another of the many heads of the colossal evil. Now it was against the incredible meanness of that proscriptive spirit which denied to the colored citizens going abroad the passport of the government, or which refused to issue patents to inventors on account of color. Now it was against those twin abominations which erected a man's color into a legal barrier to his carrying the mails, or made it a ground for excluding his testimony in judicial proceedings held under the Black Code of the District of Columbia and of the slave states, wherein, so runneth the black letter of the black law, any Christian white person is concerned. Sumner began his efforts for the annulment of this infamous law while the District Emancipation Bill was under consideration in the Senate. Aware that its total abolishment would not be immediately effected, he moved to amend the bill by the addition of a provision which prohibited the exclusion of any witness on account of color in proceeding held under the Act. This was the thin edge of the movement for the civil rights of colored persons in the United States, the first step taken by the government toward equality before the law. Having obtained so much for his colored fellow citizens, Sumner, a few months later, made a second attempt in the same direction, and this time it was to extend the immunity to all judicial proceedings in the district. The second attempt proved also successful, and equality began to erect its benign crest over the black code of the national capital. Sumner, ever persistent and indefatigable, made a third attempt still further to broaden the immunity by extending the operation of the principle non-exclusion to the Southern states in judicial proceedings had under the Confiscation and Liberation Act. But this step was farther than the Senate was ready to go at that time, and so Mr. Sumner's amendment was rejected. Congress, like the President, was singularly timid in inaugurating any novel policy in that regard, surprisingly tender of the rights and prejudices of slave masters at the expense of the slaves. Defeat had no deterrent effect upon a mind like Sumner's. Failing once, he tried again and again until he succeeded. 3 times he attempted to extend the principle of non-exclusion and equality to the proceedings in the courts of the United States before he was enabled to carry his point. In the summer of 1864, he attached his proposition to the Sundry Civil Appropriation Bill as an amendment, and thus forced its consideration upon the Senate. John Sherman trusted that after the experiences of last night, when the thermometer here rose to 93 degrees, and we were exhausted by debate on an irrelevant matter, the senator from Massachusetts would not introduce upon this appropriation bill a topic of this kind. But Mr. Sherman's protest was in vain, for neither the heat of the evening nor the disapproval of senators could deter Sumner from his purpose to purge the laws of the Union of the stain of slavery and to redress the wrongs of an oppressed race. His vigilance and persistency secured at this time a double triumph for freedom. On the selfsame appropriation bill he grafted an amendment for the abolition of the coastwise slave trade. In no other way had he been able to force the continued existence of this barbarism upon the attention of the Senate. Mr. Sherman, as chairman of the Finance Committee, deprecated the amendment, not because he was opposed to the proposition, but that he wanted his bill kept free from disputed extraneous political questions. But Sumner was firm, uncompromising, and so in the end the Senate, and not he, yielded, and the rider passed with the bill. Thomas H. Hendricks of Indiana, in the course of a speech in opposition to Sumner's amendment for the abolition of the coastwise slave trade, uttered the following significant remarks: "I'm surprised that any senator should oppose the proposition of the senator from Massachusetts, for we all know that eventually it will be adopted. The objection as to its materiality or proper connection with the measure is but an objection of time. No gentleman can question that the senator from Massachusetts will eventually carry his proposition. Why then contest the matter longer? It may as well come now as at any time. The fact is, Sumner was the anti-slavery trail finder and path opener for the government. Where he made a way, Congress and President were in time sure to follow. His earnestness and radicalism were not always relished by the administration and his associates in the government. That, however, did not make him less so. It was for him to press forward himself and to urge forward others in this emergency, whether they chose to hear and heed him or not. He had an intolerant and compromising manner toward slavery and toward anyone who sought to buttress its barbarisms with the authority of the nation whose life it was seeking to destroy, which was at times, no doubt, a sore thorn in the sides of the cautious, conciliatory president. Edward Stanley, provisional governor of North Carolina, arouses the hot indignation of this man with his passionate hatred of slavery by an attempt to revive the black code of that state, which made the teaching of Negroes a criminal offense. When Sumner heard of this shameful attempt, he hurried to lay the matter before Mr. Lincoln. Not finding that usually placid and jocose magistrate at the Executive Mansion, Sumner followed him to the War Department. There he laid his case before Mr. Stanley's master, but Mr. Stanley's master, possibly worn out with the abolition badgering with which he was treated by Mr. Sumner whenever they met, either by accident or appointment, and possibly struck also by the apparent triviality of the subject and the inopportunity of the visit, quite lost his patience, exclaiming petulantly, "Do you take me for a school committee man?" "Not at all," Sumner replied. "I take you for President of the United States, and I come with a case of wrong in attending to which your predecessor, George Washington, if alive, might add to his renown." Such earnestness and dignity smoothed the ruffled temper of George Washington's worthy successor, who thereupon, with perfect kindliness, considered the case with his friend. At last, after nearly 2 years of terrible conflict and destruction of life to save the Union with slavery, Mr. Lincoln was ready to try the other horn of the dilemma and test the salvability of the nation without slavery. To this end, on September 22, 1862, he announced his purpose to grasp emancipation as an instrument in the struggle. On that date he issued his preliminary proclamation, which declared that the slaves in all states in rebellion on January 1, 1863, should be thenceforward and forever free. Directly the President had firmly seized emancipation as a weapon for putting down the rebellion, Sumner started the agitation for colored troops. 2 weeks after the preliminary proclamation was issued, he launched from the platform of Faneuil Hall the proposition to turn the slaves into soldiers. He pointed to Crispus Attucks, to Peter Salem, and to heroic instances during the war for the Union as proof positive that the Negroes possessed the stuff out of which good fighters were formed. Strike slavery, the origin and mainspring of rebellion with the strong arm of the slave. Destroy the rebellion by destroying slavery and arming the blacks. Emancipation and colored troops are the powder and ball which Providence hath rammed into the cannon of the North. Empty the providential broadside into the flanks of the foe. These and more he thundered in the ears of the government and the country. Other and mightier voices were thundering for colored troops also, passionate voices of lamentation, of frightful reverses, of broken and flying armies, of baffled friends of the Union, whose hearts were growing sick at the gloomy, the almost hopeless outlook for a speedy restoration of peace to a bleeding and distracted land. As early as July 1862, the disastrous fortunes of the Union forces were constraining the government in its emergency to make use of all the means which the state of the country had put within its reach for the suppression of the rebellion. Military necessity was plainly demanding that the services of the blacks in some capacity should be enlisted on the side of the nation, and so on the 17th of that month the President affixed his approval to a bill authorizing him to receive into the service of the United States for the purpose of constructing entrenchments or performing camp service or any other labor or any military or naval service for which they may be found competent persons of African descent, and such persons shall be enrolled and organized under such regulations not inconsistent with the Constitution and laws as the President may prescribe. This was the first cautious step taken toward carrying Africa into the war, the beginning, in fact, of colored troops. On February 9, 1863, Mr. Sumner introduced in the Senate a bill for the enlistment of slaves and other persons of African descent, but the measure was allowed to sleep the sleep of death in the military committee to which it was referred. It was not until a year afterward that the subject was revived in the House by Thaddeus Stevens, when the employment of colored troops was expressly authorized. Colored troops were employed, however, many months before the tardy enactment of this law. On January 26, 1863, Secretary Stanton gave permission to Governor Andrew to raise a colored regiment. This regiment, the afterwards famous 54th, was raised, and the following May ordered to the seat of war in South Carolina, where, under its gallant young Colonel Robert G. Shaw, it demonstrated before Fort Wagner that the blacks had the stuff of true soldiers in them. Subsequently, Massachusetts sent 2 other regiments of colored soldiers into the field, one of infantry and the other of cavalry. Their fighting qualities were soon established. If at first the employment of colored troops was a hard riddle to many minds, those 3 black regiments wrote the glorious answer clear and large for the nation to read, and the nation, notwithstanding its pro-slavery goggles, which minimized and distorted everything connected with the humanity and manhood rights of this unfortunate race, was not so blind to its own emergent needs as to miss the point and immense significance of the lesson writ in the blood and valor of its colored contingent. But though the North was not in these circumstances blind to its own dire needs, it proved on almost every occasion, calling for justice to its colored allies, blinded enough to their simplest demands for fair and equal treatment. There is something incredibly mean in that pro-slavery spirit which, after calling men to fight and die to preserve the life of the nation, could refuse them equal pay with the other soldiers on account of their color. Nevertheless, of such incredible meanness was the government certainly guilty toward its colored troops. Keenly did Mr. Sumner feel this outrageous discrimination against his wards. Again and again he attacked it, sought repeatedly to place the black soldiers on an equality in respect of pay and bounty with their white brothers in arms. He was not alone in efforts to this end. Wilson and Frisenden in the Senate perceived with him the wrong and endeavored to have it redressed, but not with the moral earnestness and persistency which characterized the endeavors of Sumner in that regard. The 54th and the 55th Massachusetts regiments of colored troops enlisted with the understanding that there was to be no discrimination against them on account of their color. But all the same, the government paid them $10 a month, where it paid $13 to the privates of white regiments. Massachusetts tried to correct this injustice by making up out of her own coffers these $3 to the men, but when this difference was sent to be paid to those 2 regiments, they firmly declined to receive the money, lest by so doing they compromised their demand for equality in the army. In February and June of 1864, Mr. Sumner pressed this subject upon the attention of the Senate, arguing that the wrong done had no warrant in law, since those regiments did not enlist under the Act of 1862, which contained a special provision with reference to African troops, but under that of 1861, which contained no such provision and authorized enlistments for 3 years. The question was finally settled not by legislation, but through the interpretation of the statutes by the Law Department of the government. The Attorney General, Mr. Bates, in affirming the equal rights of colored soldiers, put an end to this odious cast distinction in the national service and constrained the government to a step of tardy justice. The government in both its legislative and executive branches manifested from first to last an extraordinary timidity or indisposition to advance the interest of the colored race. Fear of the border states was probably responsible for much of this singular conduct, but color phobia in the government itself played, without doubt, an important part in its production. The records of those years are full of examples of this character. Here is an instance in point. Henry Wilson, as early as January 1864, embodied in a bill to promote enlistments a clause declaring that when any man or boy of African descent, or in service or labor in any state under its laws, should be mustered into the military or naval service of the United States, he and his mother, wife, and children shall be forever free. This perfectly just and very moderate measure required a year and a month before its friends could secure its enactment into law. Future generations, exclaimed Sumner in his closing remarks upon the bill, future generations will read with amazement that a great people, when national life was assailed, hesitated to exercise a power so simple and beneficent, and this amazement will know no bounds as they learned that Congress higgled for months on a question whether the wives and children of our colored soldiers should be admitted to freedom. Slavery died hard. Fugitive slaves were hunted in the District of Columbia, even after the passage of the District Emancipation Bill. The poor fleeing creatures were returned again and again to their owners by the Union armies. These acts became so frequent and general that Congress in the summer of 1862 prohibited military and naval officers from erecting themselves into commissioners for the return of fugitive slaves on pain of being dismissed from the service. In February 1864, Mr. Sumner reported from the Committee on Slavery and Freedmen a bill for the repeal of all acts for the rendition of fugitive slaves. The bill he accompanied with a comprehensive report reviewing the history and influence of slavery in the government in its relation to these acts, and closing with a demand for their entire and instant repeal. But notwithstanding that the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued more than 13 months before, and that the Secretary of War had more than a year previously given Governor Andrew official permission to raise a regiment of colored troops, and that at the time of its introduction in the Senate several colored regiments were in the field fighting the battles of the country, yet the history of its passage through Congress was another repetition of the old shameful story. That the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act should be bitterly opposed by the Democrats was not at all surprising, but we confess to no little astonishment in noticing that Senator Sherman obstructed its passage through the Senate, that he actually sought to emasculate the bill by an amendment which saved the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 in full force on the statute book, and that this proposition was adopted and grafted on the bill by the Senate. Mr. Foster of Connecticut on April 20, 1864, made an elaborate argument in vindication of the Act of 1793. With Mr. Sherman's pro-slavery amendment grafted upon his bill, Mr. Sumner wisely refrained from pressing it to a vote, but determined, as he not infrequently did in similar circumstances, to await the action of the House, which on June 13th passed a bill repealing all the Fugitive Slave Acts. This measure Mr. Sumner reported in the Senate and pressed to a vote. It was not until the 28th of June that this bill became a law, that is, more than 5 months after the date on which Mr. Sumner introduced the proposition in the Senate. However, thanks to his persistency, Congress had at last made an end to those wicked laws and dealt another blow to the expiring slave hydra. The main proposition ever is to strike slavery whenever you can hit it, retorted Sumner to John Sherman during the consideration of the bill to liberate the wives and children of colored soldiers. Mr. Sherman had moved to postpone consideration of the measure with a view that we may act upon the main proposition, to wit, the constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. Sumner was certainly not less earnest and persistent for the adoption of the constitutional amendment than was Mr. Sherman, but he did not feel that because the joint resolution was on its passage through Congress that all anti-slavery efforts were to be pretermitted in the meantime, and without doubt it behooved him, who was bent on the death of slavery as no other member of the government was, to continue without cessation the struggle for its destruction, for the joint resolution was more than a year on its way through both branches of Congress, and it was 2 years in all from its introduction to the final ratification of the amendment by the requisite number of states and proclamation of that fact by Mr. Seward, the Secretary of State. Sumner was right to take nothing for granted where slavery was concerned, to regard the enactment of no measure, however just and expedient, which involved the abolishment of the curse as a foregone conclusion. He was strongly and sternly unwilling to commit the fate of the slaves in any degree to the chapter of accidents and chances. He was for striking the fell destroyer of the freedom of the colored race and of the peace of the Union whenever and wherever Congress could do so, and this was at all times and under all circumstances his main proposition. The final breaking down of caste distinction on the street cars of the District of Columbia was achieved largely through his active and persistent hostility to it. In hitting it, he knew well that he was hitting one of the many heads of the monster wrong of the land, and it was characteristic of him that when he began to operate with his club upon one of those baleful heads, he desisted not until that particular foe of freedom was subdued and beaten to the earth. One after another of the street car lines of the capital he attacked as they entered the Senate to obtain renewals of their franchises, with his invariable amendment to their respective bills for incorporations, provided that there shall be no regulation excluding any person from any car on account of color. The last of these street railway companies to succumb was the Washington and Georgetown Company, which in February 1865 surrendered to the genius of equality before the law. After this time it was illegal for any street railway company in the District of Columbia to exclude from its cars any person on account of color. But even then Mr. Sumner did not put aside his club, and well that he did not, for the fight for equality on the cars was not yet finished. The Washington and Georgetown Company neglected to comply promptly with the provisions of the law by keeping up the discrimination against colored persons who sought to enter its cars. When this illegal action was brought to Mr. Sumner's knowledge, he wrote a sharp note to the president of the company, calling his attention to the failure of his agents to obey the law, and serving notice on him that, unless the breach was mended, he, Mr. Sumner, would at the next session of Congress move the forfeiture of the charter of the corporation. This determined front brought the company to its senses and consummated the final opening of the streetcars of the District of Columbia to all persons regardless of race or color. Slavery is dying on sea and land. Rebellion everywhere through the length and breadth of the South is collapsing under the tremendous trip-hammering of Grant, Sherman, and the Union armies, reinforced now with more than 150,000 colored soldiers. Sherman begins his masterly march to the sea. Now Atlanta falls before the advances of his resistless legions. Now Savannah, now Charleston. Now Grant has begun those incessant and mighty blows which are to drive the rebels from Richmond, to beat to pieces the proud and hitherto invincible army of Northern Virginia, and to force Lee to surrender. All these great events were coming to pass while slavery lay writhing in death throes. Terrible in life, it was appalling in death. Its last act was worthy of it, that act which added the assassination of a president to the black mountain of its matchless horrors and iniquities. Lincoln and Sumner, though unlike, were nevertheless the best of friends. No more faithful supporter had Mr. Lincoln than was Mr. Sumner. They, notwithstanding frequent differences, were cordially appreciative of the virtues of each other. Sumner heartily and unwaveringly urged the president's claims to renomination and reelection. Others of the radical and anti-slavery wing of the Republican Party preferred Chase, but close friends as were Sumner and Chase, the former never disguised his decided preference for Mr. Lincoln as his own successor. Lincoln was slow, excessively cautious perhaps, yet he was in the main inclined abolitionward. At any rate, he was a bird in the hand, while all other candidates were regarded by Sumner as politically so many birds in the bush. He very wisely refused to imperil the anti-slavery accomplishments and prospects of the war in the crisis of a change of administration. The circumstances of his last conference with the President are infinitely creditable to the heads and hearts of both. In June 1864, it appears that the Smith brothers of Boston were, by order of the Navy Department, charged with fraud in the performance of certain contracts with that department. They were imprisoned in Fort Warren, and bail placed at $500,000. The trial of these men was held before a military tribunal, which sentenced them to 2 years' imprisonment and to pay a fine of $20,000. Sumner laid the case of the convicted men before the President and appealed to him to revoke the sentence of the court. Mr. Lincoln, who was evidently impressed with Mr. Sumner's representation of the facts, requested him to read the report to the Secretary of the Navy in relation to the case and to give an opinion of the same. This Sumner did at once and prepared for the President a written opinion thereon. As soon as this was done, he presented himself at the Executive Mansion. It was late in the afternoon, and the illustrious object of his visit was on the point of entering his carriage for a drive. The President suggested that the transaction be put off until next day, but Mr. Sumner replied that it was a case which did not admit of delay, and that the President ought not to sleep that night until he had considered it. Touched by Mr. Sumner's earnestness, Mr. Lincoln made an appointment with him for 11 o'clock that evening. At that hour, and through a thunderstorm, Mr. Sumner joined the President, who was promptly on hand to listen to the opinion which he had requested. At the conclusion of the reading of it, Mr. Lincoln said that he would write his opinion at once, and invited Mr. Sumner to call the next morning to hear it, adding defensively that he opened shop at 9 o'clock. At the time appointed, Mr. Sumner was on hand and read with satisfaction the President's disapproval of the judgment and sentence. While Mr. Sumner was making an abstract of the presidential endorsement, Mr. Lincoln regaled him with passages from the effusions of Petroleum v. NAACP. The reading was diversified with a running commentary from the reader. For the genius to write these things, I would gladly give up my office, he repeated enthusiastically to Mr. Sumner as the message which he had sent the author. This singular entertainment lasted about half an hour. It was the last time that these two great men met for the transaction of public business. From March 23, 1865, the President left Washington to join General Grant at City Point, where he remained until after the fall of Richmond. He returned to Washington April 9th, and on the following Friday evening, April 14th, was shot by John Wilkes Booth and died early the next morning. No more generous and glowing tribute was pronounced over the grave of the illustrious martyr to liberty and union than was Sumner's eulogy before the municipal authorities of the city of Boston, June 1, 1865. True to his habit of ending no speech unless in some way it demanded the destruction of slavery, the orator did not allow such an imposing occasion to pass without calling for the total annihilation of the accursed thing, with its vast spider-like web of caste and inequality. The permanent supremacy in the Republic of the ideas for which the North had fought depended, he solemnly declared, above the grave of the great statesman who had met martyrdom for those ideas, upon the extension of the suffrage to the colored men of the South. Indemnity for the past and security for the future was the one cue which he had chosen to guide his feet through the mazes of reconstruction of the rebellious states. End of chapter 13.